This is Democracy in Lockdown, a weekly virtual conversation on the latest news about the coronavirus crisis and what it means for our democracy. This podcast is presented by Unlock Democracy. We campaign for a better democracy and a new written constitution built and owned by the people.
My name is Sam, and I work at Unlock Democracy, and we also have with us today...
My name is Trudy, and I also work at Unlock Democracy. Funny that.
Trudy, how are you coping with lockdown at the moment?
Pretty well. Very fortunate. Feeling very fortunate to have a job that I can work from home with. We have a nice little bit of green space, so feeling quite fortunate. So coping quite well, apart from all the stresses, all the daily stresses of being cooped up inside. How about yourself?
Good stuff. Yeah, not too bad. Got a fair bit of space where I am, and the funny thing is, in Cardiff, we've had the longest undisrupted sunny weather since at least last August. So as long as our state mandated exercise is still allowed for a little while, then that'll really help me stay sane. So a lot has happened in the past month, hasn't it? It's the 7th of April today, and I was just thinking about what we were up to on this day a month ago. Well, we saw each other that day. I got on a train to Bristol and took part in a workshop that we were doing about the Conservative government's new threats to our democracy. Do you remember that?
I do, and it seems like way more than a month ago. I was looking at the calendar the other day and I realised, oh God, it was Bristol Transformed the other month, which was a really great event and loads. It was really nice, to socialise with people. But yeah, that's where I was a month ago, which seems so far away.
Yeah, just casually getting a coffee in a cafe and then trundling back on the train seems like a very long time ago. So, is there anything that you're reading at the moment that you're enjoying particularly, or that you want to share with anyone that's listening?
I mean, I've not been getting into books yet. I've been more reading lots of long reads, and publications are cropping up now that people are working from home. So I'm getting stuck into all the long read coronavirus response work that's happening. There's some parliamentary stuff that I've been reading, like the Overseas Operations Service and Personnel Bill, things like that. Not very exciting, but there are some really good blogs at the minute, and some really good coverage out there. What about yourself?
So over the last weekend, I started reading a new book that arrived called Democracy Doesn't Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And yeah, it came out only last year, but it talks about how democracy is this big idea that we have, that a lot of the systems we actually have in the real world don't live up to in a lot of ways, but that it's a good ideal to be working towards. But it also talks about a lot of the tensions that we have in trying to negotiate a democratic society, and I think that's really important today, because we're talking about the coronavirus emergency powers and what they mean for our democracy. And I think that this goes to to the heart of some of these tensions, really, because we have to think about the difference between our freedom to do something and our freedom from something. I think that's a really crucial thing for what's going on here, because our our freedom to go out for a walk or to drive a car or to do what we've normally do is being curtailed, so that we all have the freedom from dying of a really horrible disease. And that's a distinction that's not often made, and I think that's going to be a really interesting lens for us to have this conversation today. So all over the planet, people are living under lockdowns, unprecedented crackdowns on our rights and freedoms, but they're being done in the interest of the community welfare as a whole. So it's hard to get a sense of how proportionate they are, because this isn't a straightforward case of a government saying we want to hold on to power, so we're going to stop people from protesting. It's genuinely for the health of the whole community. And all the evidence says that the public are overwhelmingly willing to make these sacrifices, both in terms of polling data that's been available, but also in the really high levels of compliance with the advice that people are taking. That's what the information that we're getting from the ground, from police forces. But what about when the immediate emergency is over? Are we going to see a general ratcheting up of restrictions on our rights? And how are these emergency measures going to be applied on the ground? So I think these are some really interesting questions that we need to grapple with. So before we set out to have this conversation today, we posed some questions online about what people want to hear about in a conversation about these emergency powers. But we also asked our members and supporters what they were concerned about at the moment. So we send out a newsletter every week or so called the Slingshot, and we asked people whether they think that democracy will emerge from this crisis in a stronger position or in a weaker position. And not many people were saying stronger, but there was quite a big divide between people that think it wouldn't change very much. We had 21% of people say that they don't think democracy will change after this crisis, whereas some people thought that it would be weaker. So 34% of people thought that democracy would come out of this situation somewhat weaker, while 26.6% thought we'd come out of it much weaker, which is a pretty concerning place for people to be. And we also asked people, is there anything that not democracy should be focusing our attention on, or is there something that's not getting enough attention in the media right now? And what we also found that was interesting was that the use and abuse of emergency powers was selected by 37.6% of people. So that's something that people are very concerned about. Let's go into some of the background of this and kick off the conversation. A few weeks ago, the coronavirus bill was passed, and that contained a broad set of emergency powers that have never been seen in peacetime before. The government originally wanted these powers to apply for 2 years from the time it was passed, but after opposition from Labour saying we want this to be reduced to 6 months, that was granted and the bill was passed. So this is having sweeping effects on our everyday rights to assemble, but it's also watering down lots of rights temporarily that you might not expect. For example, you might think that people needing social care, older people in the community or people with learning disabilities, for example, might get more care as we mobilise people to look after people in need. But what's actually happened is that care standards have been reduced instead, and in lots of ways, the legal standards that can be enforced have been lowered for the duration of the crisis. So something that's really concerning is how long this is going to be going on for, whether it's purely for the limit of the public health emergency as it stands, or whether these things are going to be creeping on long after that. Trudy, have you seen anything in these powers that makes you particularly concerned at all?
Well, definitely there's been a lot of focus on security and police powers. So much like in the Conservative Manifesto, very security-heavy language is something that they are very focused on, especially even before the crisis. So I'm worried about the extent of these powers and whether they will be turned on and turned off where appropriate, as they say, or whether they extend for the full 2 years, or what will be left with after the end of the coronavirus bill, whether there will be new legislation, whether that will be normalized. But yeah, very, very cautious.
Yeah, definitely. So these powers, as we said, are the strongest ones we've ever had in peacetime, and actually replaced legislation that already exists for these sorts of situations. So we have the Civil Contingencies Act, which is something that was passed in the Labour government, which allows for many of these powers to be granted temporarily. But what's really interesting about that is that has to be renewed by Parliament every 30 days, I believe, which is very different to this law, which stretches out to at least 6 months and possibly to 2 years. So I think the way these powers have been applied and how long they last for really differs in different countries, and that shows what different people are willing to put up with in terms of how long these powers last for. So we'll come to that a little bit later on. But what I thought would be good to talk about for a while is how the response from governments has differed in different countries and how authoritarian these have been, and maybe where the UK fits into that picture. So while doing the research for this, we found an incredible quote from the president of the Philippines, where he was basically saying that he would order the police and army to shoot on sight anyone violating quarantine. Now that's in line with other statements he's said about other things in the past. But that's absolutely chilling, and it's just right at the top of a spectrum of response that governments have been doing across the world. So, Trudy, you've been having a look at some other examples of how these crackdowns have varied in severity across the world and how the police are policing them, for example. So, is there any particular things that you want to pull out and tell us about?
Yeah, well, what I've noticed is that there's been a range of ways that governments have responded. So you have invoking emergency powers through the European Convention on Human Rights. You have primary legislation like what has happened in the UK and what has happened in France. Like the coronavirus bill, the French government have put in place an emergency health bill instead of emergency powers. And other countries are declaring a state of emergency. So the basic response has varied in that way. The overarching theme is obviously security and how to enforce a lockdown that is exceptional in terms of it's an infringement on human rights. Is it what is necessary and what is proportionate? So Japan today have declared a state of emergency, but for example in Japan there's a lot more of a culture, I would say a culture of authority. So the emergency powers give the governors the authority to call on the people to stay at home and for businesses to close. So it gives them that authority. But what the Japanese government have not put in place is enforcement, fines, the things that we generally see here and in other places in Europe. The enforcement relies more on peer pressure in that sense, and and respect for authority.
Yeah, I remember seeing as well that a lot of people in Japan were wearing masks without anyone telling them to a lot of time beforehand, and that there's just this deference culture perhaps that meant that the authorities didn't have to respond in the way they have here. And something we'll come to later on is the difference between what the law actually says and how the police are applying the law, and how there's been some maybe miscommunication from the government on that part. Are there any other countries that you think are really worth pulling out and throwing into the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll come on to Hungary in a minute because that's like another one of, much like the Philippines, is a lot more of a controversial approach. But it's worth mentioning Spain, who've one of the strictest lockdown procedures in Europe. Now they've been hit very hard by the pandemic. So their state of emergency is actually written into their constitution, and in that it expires after after 30 days, and it can be renewed, but it has to go through their parliament basically. So what we have in comparison is that our extra powers must be renewed by parliament after 6 months and expires after 2 years. So you have this difference in how much scrutiny is being brought to the emergency legislation in the UK or the protocol in Spain. So this has given police much of the same powers to find and arrest people. And to put that into perspective, by the end of March in Spain, police had issued 100,000 citations and arrested 1,000 people for violating social distancing regulations. Fines can range from €100 to €30,000 for serious violations. Now, I don't know what 30,000, what you have to do to be fined €30,000, sorry. Wow. That must be a pretty serious violation. I'm not sure if it has actually happened. We have had some reports of drones being used by police. They have been using that in Spain as well, and the police have also set up 30,000 roadblocks to stop people from traveling. Now, you see, like, much of this as quite similar, maybe apart from the roadblocks, is something that we don't have here. I would say that it's that 30-day renewal, that it being brought back to the government, and a much more of a collaborative approach to responding to coronavirus from Spain, in terms of their communications with the rest of the assembly and with their own devolved powers. By contrast, Hungary. So Viktor Orban has used the state of emergency to gain unfettered power for an unlimited amount of time. So it basically, this state of emergency has let him bypass the whole constitutional infrastructure and has pretty much made it irrelevant. Now, what we've seen come out of that is that the emergency decrees have seen a rise in military presence. So by the end of March, for example, some 51 of 108 hospitals were put under the direction of a military commander, which is something which is unimaginable here. So that is the kind of knock-on effect it has had, and it's the kind of, you can see what is going to come out. You can see what worrying things might come out of that, even though it is still an ongoing situation.
Yeah, definitely. Really terrifying stuff from Hungary. And it seems to me that the way that that's tolerated is part of, that hasn't just come out of nowhere. It's not just a well-functioning democracy that has just suddenly said, yeah, we're going to give all these powers to tackle this health crisis. Hungary has been for a number of years now going down this kind of authoritarian populist route where the will of the people, quote unquote, and the will of the majority is more important than the principles of democracy itself. And I think that the different ways in which these lockdowns have been managed and imposed in different countries in Europe, for example, maybe reflects how much people are thinking about these things. So, say in the UK, the idea of the military running hospitals is just something that we can't think about. That's not part of our culture. And again, I think the government is still very reluctant about the idea of having the military on the streets, helping to police the lockdown in a way that's maybe not as big a problem in other European countries. And again, I think roadblocks, which we have seen some examples of, isolated instances of in the UK, of police doing, particularly around national parks, is a very concrete, this feels authoritarian, but it's not something that we're having here yet. But so it shows that, to me, the UK is maybe not in a massively healthy place in terms of how we think about our democratic institutions and our response to this crisis, but it's certainly by no means the worst either. Which I think brings us on to talking about police powers. So what we've seen is that the government has issued, finally, relatively clear guidance that says that you should only leave your house for 4 purposes. That's to go to work if you can't do it from home, to care for a vulnerable person, to get food or medication, or to exercise once a day. And this once a day thing is quite interesting, right? Because there's nothing in the law that restricts it to that. There's nothing in the law saying that you can't go for a drive, but the police are interpreting this stuff very differently. So the difference between what the government is saying and most people voluntarily complying with that because it's in the interests of public health, as far as we know, and the difference between what the police can legally enforce is something that is maybe a bigger problem for us. We don't have that kind of deferential attitude to authority in the way countries like Japan have, as you've already said. So, Trudy, are there any particular egregious examples that you've been seeing of how the police have been acting in this situation?
For me, no. I mean, I've seen more of a confusion in the community around me of what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. For example, like we have a group for everybody who lives locally to me, and what you see is like, well, at the weekend we had lots of people out sunbathing. They were socially distanced. They were way more than 2 meters apart. I mean, in this context, it looked like it was really busy, but who's to say? And what you had, you had this strange response of, you could see on social media, people were questioning, should I be phoning the police? What should I be doing? I definitely found myself looking out my window questioning, oh, is that okay? What is okay? So I think more of what I've recognized from my local community, and especially in some of the wider area Facebook groups, has been a complete confusion as to what to do, sometimes leading to the point where people, whatever, I'll do what I want because the guidance isn't clear enough. But definitely, I haven't, to be honest with you, seen any police around recently, but I mean, I also haven't been out that much. What about you, Sam?
So there's quite a big park near where I live, where I go for a run or a walk most days. And on the weekend, the weather was really nice. I think it is in London too, where it wasn't busy in terms of people were not keeping social distancing, but yeah, there were some people kind of sunbathing or otherwise keeping still instead of doing exercise when they're out. And yeah, it's really unclear what the guidance should be on that. No police around, but that might change in the future if these reports that we're getting of people not practicing distancing do get worse. But I noticed on the Wales Online website, which is a big news website here, that they were sending people around taking photos of abandoned beaches and abandoned tourist resorts, which is kind of quite different to the loads of people are ignoring social distancing headlines that they might have been hoping for. Wanted to then move on to the scrutiny of these powers and what opportunities there are to challenge, because we've already talked about how in some countries every 2 weeks these powers need to be refreshed, all the way down to in Hungary they've been just given to Viktor Orban with no cut-off date for that, in a really terrifying authoritarian development. So as we've said already, it's a 6 months limit on the Coronavirus Act that was passed a few weeks ago, and if that's extended by Parliament it could go up to 2 years. So that's a really long time that is not in any way coupled with how long the immediate danger of the virus could last. It could be another 6 months, we could be looking at 18 months or more. We'll have to find out more as the announcements come from the public health officials about that. But we're finding that there's really not the level of scrutiny of these powers that we could have seen. Although some people made the point, some MPs made the point that some of these measures went too far in Parliament, there's just practically not many things that could be done to have a robust debate about this. I thought that was an interesting contrast to the Welsh Assembly, which is actually using online plenaries now. They're conducting their normal proceedings as a virtual parliament, which gives better opportunities for scrutiny. So I thought that was quite interesting, and maybe if that's one thing that could maybe modernise the workings of Westminster at the end of this, that would be quite a good thing. So Trudy, there was what would normally be quite a big political development over this weekend. Do you know what it is that I'm referring to?
The Labour leadership?
Yes. So Keir Starmer became the new leader of the Labour Party over this weekend. That would normally be quite a big development, but has been kind of overshadowed by what's going on. And I think it's going to be very interesting for him, because he occupies kind of this half in, half out figure where he's been very involved in the justice system in the past, and is now very much having to hold the government to account for this. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what actual opportunities there are for him and the Labour Party to do that when Parliament isn't sitting, and maybe the only way he can raise things is by mentioning them in the media in a way that the government has there's no requirement on them to come before a select committee or anything like that, at least for the next few weeks. Is there anything you'd add to that about, it's going to be very interesting to see what Keir Starmer says about how these powers are applied or how long they're kept in for?
Well, yeah, I noticed on the news that whenever I was looking for the results of the later leadership election, for example, I didn't get a push notification about it. It was only whenever Keir had made a statement about coronavirus, that news cycle, if you know what I mean. So I think one thing is that there will really be a struggle for people to get their voice heard at this point in time. Definitely anything that is not coronavirus related will be pushed to the wayside, more or less.
Yeah, absolutely. That's towards the end of the time we've got to talk about this today. But before we do, wanted to talk about some of the things that people have been saying on our social media channels about the questions of emergency powers and what we pose to them. So some of the comments range from, the establishment will never relinquish its power and privilege without a fight, and it will just return to the same not-for-purpose institution that it is now. That's someone referring to Westminster, I think. But then someone else says that the government will never miss an opportunity to grab power and remove freedoms. So there's obviously a lot of reticence and some fear among about where this is going to head. Before we go, just want to leave you with something to ask. So Unlock Democracy is run by a governing council, and we're asking people to take part in our upcoming elections to that council by becoming a member before the 15th of April. So if you become a member by then, you'll be able to vote in the elections to our council, and you'll also be able to stand yourself for that council if that's how you're inclined. So find out about that information on our social media, or you can go to unlockdemocracy.org.uk/takepart2020. So thanks so much for spending this time with us today. Please leave us your comments and ideas for topics, for things we can discuss in the future. So we'll see you next week. Thanks, Trudy.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll be coming back next Thursday with more. Remember, you can reach us on social media and tell us what you think we should discuss next week. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share. Stay home, stay safe.